These questions are extraordinary. I'm telling you, these are very rich questions. We'll do what we can. Many of them do overlap, so that's good. And I want to say thank you to John for giving us the Dr. John Money story and the Reimer twins. I don't hear that story told very often. And Dr. John Money never was a man more aptly named. Really ended up with 65 awards and honors and never disclosed the disaster of the Reimer case that was used to encourage thousands of similar experiments. Unbelievable. So thank you for using that story. Okay, this week we learned that our 13-year-old daughter has been accessing hardcore pornography using an old phone she found in our home. We've also learned that she was led into this by a young lady friend, and we're lovingly, gently trying to get to the bottom of this. There may have also been a physical component of this other girl's outreach to our daughter. Needless to say, we are gobsmacked and heartsick. Much of what she viewed appears to have been lesbian and or violent in nature. We are particularly concerned that she may have or may come to question her sexual identity, either because of what she has seen or what she has experienced. We would cherish any advice. Father,
sure.
You want to take that? You've got the collar.
I've got the collar. I've also got a certification in sexual addiction treatment.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
That's right.
It's weird to sit. So first and foremost, I'd say I'm sorry that happened, and I'm sorry that you came to discover that the way you did, but also grateful that something happened to bring that to light. And so the first thing I would encourage, right, is that when you have conversations with your daughter, that they always start from that place of mercy, and they start with more questions. And a first question to always ask when anybody discovers any child of any age has been accessing pornography is, when was the first time that you saw pornography? And the reason to ask that question is because we can overreact because of the age they are or what they're viewing, but we might find out that they were 7, or we might find out that they were 8. And then there's a chance to talk to, why didn't you ever tell me about that? I'm sorry you didn't feel like you could talk to me about it. And I want to do better with that. To find out, how did that happen? What's that, how does that make you feel? What's going on there? Are you struggling with invasive thoughts? Because that's totally normal. And it's actually a response to trauma when we have invasive, impure thoughts after seeing pornography. Because our brains just saw something that it's not designed to see, and then our brains try to make sense out of the thing that's confusing. And so invasive, impure thoughts continue to come back over and over and over again. It might be something that she needs to talk to somebody about just to process it. But then it's really important to follow up with how she's doing in the future, right? How many times have you gone back to this? Are you continuing to, was there contact with this other girl? What can we do, right? And so the best way to prevent it from becoming something that becomes more compulsive, more hidden, more shameful, is to engage in a lot of conversation around it and give her the space to be able to do that without fear of getting in trouble or without fear of shame. And as a parent, you might need to go talk to somebody about how you feel about what you saw your daughter did, because sometimes our own anxiety leaks out and it makes the other person feel anxious, right? Does that make sense? I remember talking to priests. I got this spiritual director one time, and I was like, I really need help. I'm going to start by telling you my whole sexual history. And I got done, and he looked at me and he was like, whoa. Well, God wants us to be perfect. And I was like, oh my gosh, I can't talk to this person because I feel like I just scandalized them by what I told them. And I need to be able to talk to somebody who's just going to be like, okay, that happens, and I want to help you so that you do better. Right? It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have gender dysphoria or anything like that. but they just need to work through it and try to do better going forward.
Yeah,
So,
good.
sorry, that was a long answer.
John, Paul, anything you'd like to add?
The only thing I would add is that when you go looking for a counselor, make sure that it's a Catholic counselor who understands the Church's teachings and is willing to abide by those in the counseling, because there are far too many counseling places, even those that profess to be Christian counselors, that have fully endorsed the cultural view of human sexuality, and so that's a pitfall to avoid.
Yeah. So can I piggyback on that?
Yeah.
Make sure that you go to a counselor that understands compulsive sexual behaviors, which might be more important than the counselor being Catholic. There are plenty of Catholic counselors who don't understand compulsive sexual behaviors, and like I've seen that go very badly for people. And you just have to make sure your counselor is ethical, which means that they're going to respect the faith system of the client. And I have that conversation with people all the time. I call counselors all the time and I say, my client, my spiritual directee, they are really Catholic and they want to follow the Church's teaching. And I know that you're going to follow the ethical system that they fall in because you're required to by your state licensure. But I just want to be able to give them confidence that I talked to you about this, and then they know that I'm going to report them if they do something unethical. And counselors, especially in that world, they're so trained to respect whatever ethical system. Like there's special training modules on Hasidic Jews who have more strict sex rules than we do. And so like, you don't always have to be afraid, okay? You just have to make sure that person's qualified.
So have Father Sean talk to your counselor before you engage them.
You can do it too.
To Dr. Cruz, thinking about what you said, regarding the 5-inch difference in male-female height, and how things like hormones in children have changed puberty. What, if any, implications does this have on gender dysphoria? And that may be unknown, but.
So if I understand, the question, it relates to trying to understand, the differences that may have contributed. Many people have put forward theories about not just genetic variation, but environmental exposures as well. And I don't think we can discount that they may have an influence. But I think the data is very clear that there's much more going on than that. They may be a contributing factor. One of the best pieces of evidence that I can give is the example of children that are females that are born with adrenal hyperplasia. And they are exposed to very high levels of testosterone from development because of this disorder. And in the vast majority of those individuals, while they may exhibit more what we would consider tomboyish behaviors, their gender identity is vastly over 90% of female. And so that tells us a very important fact, that not to discount that environmental exposures or even genetic influences may have something to do with it, that it's not the driving factor. So I think that there's really, when we work our way through these differences, either genetically, what we inherited, or environmental exposures, I think the predominant influence appears, and I think I want to always be cautious. You don't want to say anything too definitively while the science is unsettled. I think the environmental contributors are certainly the primary driving factor for the vast majority of individuals, and it may occur in the context of these other environmental or genetic influences.
Okay. And John, this is a question that's often in the news. Current legal battles with biological men in biological women's athletics. What's the law on this now?
Yeah, well, we're litigating a number of those cases right now. In 22 states, they've adopted ADF model bills, Save Women's Sports bills, that ensure that athletics are assigned based on biological sex. And when I say biological sex, there is only one kind of sex, but then it gets people thinking, oh yeah, biology, as opposed to gender identity. And those laws have been challenged in a number of different places. Some have been upheld, some have been struck down. At some point, the U.S. Supreme Court is going to have to decide whether Title IX, the federal law that created the women's sports movement in the 1970s, whether it allows bills like this. And then there's a separate category of cases where women have been subjected to competing against men and lost. So for example, we represent 4 very brave former high school athletes from Connecticut, and these women lost 15 state track and field titles to 2 men who identified as female. And so the separate question is whether that happening violated Title IX, and that they have a right to have the records corrected so that everybody knows that they were the champions. And disturbingly, the federal judge who first heard the case dismissed it and said, well, even if I changed the records, everybody would know who still won. Which was so dismissive of the rights that they had. But we just got the Federal Court of Appeals to reverse that, and it's going back. And so that class of cases will be proceeding too. I do think that across the country, that the issue of women's sports is one of the things that really opened up a lot of Americans' eyes to the gender ideology movement in the United States. When they started to have bathroom policies where boys who identified as girls could use the shower or locker room, there wasn't as much of an uproar about that as you would expect. But watching a male appearing as a female, finishing a half a lap around the track ahead of everybody else, or winning an NCAA swimming meet, beating 2 female Olympians in the process, that really got people worked up. And there are a lot of brave women around the country who are speaking out very courageously about that issue.
This is, what's funny about this is that this is not the first time that we've faced this. Back in the 1976, 1977, there was the case of Renee Richards in professional tennis, and she actually, I think, won the right to compete, and she retired in 1981. But the reason I bring her up is because oftentimes we're given these stories where people who transition experience some grand emancipation, like I've really found myself, and what we don't hear is we don't hear the long-term stories. So let me just tell you a bit about Renee Richards, because thankfully she went on to write 2 books. And in one of her books there's a whole chapter called Regrets. And I've never seen this used anywhere in our current conversation about this. But people wanted to know, did she regret the surgery? And what's interesting is she says, that's not even a question I can answer. I was under a compulsion. I could not do it, is what she said, which is very interesting. And she simply doesn't understand the contagion going on now, completely alien to her experience. But here's a few of the regrets that she laid out. And again, there's an ESPN 30 for 30 special called Renee, which is worth seeing. I regret that circumstances turned me into a transsexual, whether through nature or nurture. I regret that I developed the urge to start dressing as a girl and fantasizing about one. I regret that I couldn't fight off the urge. I regret that I did not have the courage to go against family pressure and make a life for myself in athletics. It might have saved me. Richard Raskin was actually quite a good athlete. He was captain of the tennis team at Yale and was scouted by the Yankees. I regret that I did not reach my full potential in medicine. The psychic energy I might have put into medical research was spent coping with my personal problems. I regret that I loved women, not men. I have been in love 3 times, each time with a woman. As Renee, I've never loved a man in the way Richard loved those 3 women. I regret most deeply that one of those women had an abortion because I let my psychoanalyst talk me into allowing it. I might have succeeded as a man with this beloved woman if not for that abortion. I regret what I did to my son. His pain was immeasurable, and he still suffers from the loss of his father as he knew him. I regret on religious grounds. I'm a Jew. The Torah forbids the sorts of things I have done. I carry that guilt. Finally, I regret being a facsimile. I will never be more than a fax, a woman with a Y chromosome, no ovaries, no uterus, no capacity to bear children. This is a woman, after many years, deep experience, and as a pioneer in transsexual activity. She's not speaking from idealized ideology. This is a story that is regularly overlooked, even though she was, in the 1970s, the biggest name associated with this issue that we're discussing. Paul, do you affirm that gender dysphoria is a serious mental disorder and a much more serious spiritual disorder?
So I think that the way to understand this, that there are elements of the sex discordant gender identity that much of the dialogue is trying to take this term disorder and remove it entirely. The history I didn't go into as far as how we've recognized this. In the fourth edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that psychiatrists use, it was referred to as gender identity disorder. And the transition from that to the current version, where they use the term gender dysphoria, was intentional in trying to make the claim that there's nothing disordered about this. Yet they needed to remain in the manual to justify medical interventions. As this has evolved, I think as John had mentioned, that it's not over right now as far as where the direction of the ideological influence of, they're trying to move beyond that. You don't require dysphoria to be able to have access to these manipulations of hormones and surgery, of this, what they now are terming embodiment rights, that one has the right to be able to transform their body in any way they desire. It's important to recognize that transition from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria was based on zero science. There was not a landmark study that came forward that suddenly said that we were wrong, and we know now, that this is, with the claims they say this is a normal part of human variation, those are ideological arguments that are being made. And so I think as we think about this, as what is it psychological, is it biological? Just recognize that much of the dialogue that's going on right now is intentional in trying to convey something that is not based upon scientific principles. And it's not to say that there's much that we do. I mean, in the various disciplines, when we talk about the relationship between faith and reason, they're distinct domains with distinct tools, with distinct gifts that they can bring to that conversation. But when you try to make an argument about disorder or not disorder, from a scientific standpoint, when it's actually based on something that's outside of science, you're bound to fail. And we just need to be aware of that.
What do you think is the likelihood that good science will prevail?
Well, I like to be an optimist in that truth is truth. And this is what we're seeing in Europe as well. That as much as we try to claim these ideological arguments, the people that are being affected by this are becoming more, people are becoming more aware of this. The science itself is woven its way into far beyond even the dialogue on gender dysphoria. It's actually a threat to the whole enterprise of science. Now, we're disillusioned if we think that science has always been in this pure plane of people being objective. It's always had difficulties in the way we've conducted science. There's always been bias. What gets funded to be able to do research on, what papers get published, and the dialogue. But what we're seeing now is jettisoning of the very principles of the scientific method, which has gone on before, but people aren't challenging that when it's very obvious. They're accepting it in a way that is very harmful. It erodes public confidence in being able to support science, but it also leads to ways that we respond to what we claim is scientific evidence that is not true, that has great harm. And I think that this is a threat across the scientific enterprise and in academic institutions, not even in the hard sciences. We see this in other areas as well.
Okay. Thank you. Father, I think this is one you can start with. My son hasn't talked to me for years, never answered texts, didn't invite me to his wedding, called and told me he was trans about a year ago. I quit even trying to approach him because he blocked me. What do I do?
And so again, like whoever wrote that, I'm very sorry for everything that you're going through, and so in that perspective of like, I desire to love my son, like I desire to have him in my life, like I want him to know that I'm here for him, even like in an attempt to say I love you, even in a moment in which you don't want to be loved. But also trying to be respectful of boundaries, like writing written letters, if you have an address, can be, it can just be a really good way of communicating. One, because you can proofread your letter and go back over it and check it with a friend and say, does this sound like judgy, or like, am I getting across what I want to get across here? And then you send it, and then they have to deal with the fact that there's like a piece of paper sitting in front of them. Mm-hmm. And then your son is going to sit there and go, do I want to open this or not open this? And they might stare at it for a couple weeks, and then they might open it, and then they might read it. And so just to send mail, because it's too easy you can delete text, you can block people's numbers, you can do all that. If you send mail, then they have like this physical representation of the fact that you're trying to get a hold of them. And you just like do your best, and you continue to pray that our Lord will send them whoever they need. And also just to look for any of the places where, okay, like maybe, like we all have to take ownership. Like my sister, who felt very rejected by me because I didn't go to her wedding, I started a conversation with her by saying, like, I am sorry that I have not been around in the way that you needed me to be, and I'm just taking ownership for that. And it can help to just take ownership for our part in things when we're trying to reach out and repair relationships.
John, did you say the purpose of our bodies is as an icon of the Trinity? Please explain.
Yeah, so the whole idea that flows from the theology of the body is that a husband and a wife coming together and having a son or a daughter is an icon, an image, a mirror that shows us somewhat of what the Trinity is like. And we call it an icon because it's not an exact replica. Obviously, there's no human relationships that could ever mirror the relationship between God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. But it does give us some insight in the way that eternal exchange of love is supposed to work. And just to be clear, just because we have a spousal meaning to the body doesn't mean that every one of us is called to be in a marriage relationship. The fact that we have priests and nuns and religious who take vows of chastity is a beautiful example of the spousal meaning of the human body, because it's something that is wonderful to participate in, and how wonderful to be able to give that up and devote your entire life to God. Whole books have been written about this. So just because we can image it doesn't mean that that's the only way that we have to live our lives. And I think that the example of our priests and religious are an extraordinary example of what it means to have an eternal exchange of love with God and with all of his children.
There are a number of questions here about causes of gender dysphoria. So I'll just throw what people are asking. Is gender dysphoria linked to homosexuality? Is it linked to pornography? Is it linked to autogynephilia? Is it just a selfish fetish? You get the idea. It's trying to make linkage between gender dysphoria and behaviors that are unsavory.
I can begin by sharing the data that we do have, but distinguishing how the demographic has changed and so that the older data may not be truly representative. As I shared earlier, the experience of individuals that had sex discordant gender identity that did not persist, there is existing literature that suggests that the vast majority of those individuals, after that desistance outcome, are going to have same-sex attraction. So that really, it's the older data, but there are some, so whether it's causal versus associative in the fact that individuals are struggling with their sexual identity. There are theories, that in our current society, that's one way for somebody, for example, a female that has same-sex attraction with another female, if their identity is male, then that attraction then is not disordered in the thinking of the mind. Now, I don't claim that I have answers, to the questions fully, but that is there. When we talk about, and then again, to be very clear that these different events in people's lives, whether it's exposure to pornography, whether it's the family dynamics, that they're strained, or it's a friend, that introduces them to this idea. There are many of the contributing factors, and so I think it's very tempting to want to be able to have, in a blanket way, say, this is what is causing this, but the reality is we don't have enough information. It's very likely that we're going to err if we make overgeneralizations. But I think there is an association between those that are struggling with their gender identity that are also, we kind of group sexual identity, gender roles, and sexual orientation all into one basket, but they all speak to different dimensions of our sexuality that need to be considered in relation, but also in their individuality.
Oh, sure. Go right ahead.
So one of the things I might ask somebody who asked that question is like, why is that important to you? And the reason I ask that question is because so many times, and we all fall into this, right? Like, I need to know what's causing it so I can fix it. Like, we fall into that about our own addictive behaviors. We can fall into that about, like, there's an infidelity in a marriage. We can, like, I want to know why. And if I know why, then we can fix it. And I think it's important to remember, like, the catechism with regard to homosexuality says, right, that the cause is widely unknown. That's what the church teaches. The church doesn't teach that homosexuality is caused by trauma. The church doesn't teach that homosexuality is caused by having a bad relationship with your dad. The church, those things exist, but it's not everyone's experience. And if we want to know the experience of the person in front of us, then we should ask them, okay, so you are telling me that you're trans. What does that mean to you? Or what is that like for you? And I really want to know what that's like for you. And again, you might ask them, like, what's your sexual orientation? Like, where do you fall with that? Like, what do you want to, like, what do you see as a long-term, like, relationship goals? Like where are you right now in life? And we might propose some things, like if somebody just tells me, like, I just don't feel comfortable, like I feel dissociated from my body, I don't have emotions. Well, okay, like, let's look at some things that might cause that, like doing differential diagnosis. I've only had really like 2 people that have directly contacted me. One was a girl who was presenting as a boy in high school, who started puberty in 3rd grade and didn't know it was coming, right? So she had the onset of her period in 3rd grade at school and thought she was bleeding to death. Now, a lot of girls might have a similar experience to that when they didn't have proper education from their mom or whatever. She also was very young when she started to develop. And so, like, she became alienated from any, like, her femininity at a very young age. And whenever the topic of puberty came up, she would start to cry. And she would say, I don't know why I'm crying. Like, I would be pretty confident to say, like, she should be treated for trauma and then see what happens. But I'm trying to be careful to say, I don't say, if you get treated for trauma, it'll go away. Or if you get treated for trauma, it'll clear it up. I know people who have had same-sex attraction, but they also have sexual abuse, and they get treated for trauma, and it opens up their interests. But we can't get away from our past behaviors. Like, our Lord transforms our wounds, he doesn't erase them.
Yeah.
Jesus is born and he has resurrected wounds. He's not born without wounds.
Right.
or he's not resurrected without wounds. And so I just think that those things, like, it's important to, like, if you want to know what caused the more important question might be to ask them, like, what's that like for you, and what do you mean by that? And sometimes that's hard, because what we want to do is just, like, tell them why they're wrong, because it's hard for us to accept that this is a hard thing.
Yeah, that's very good. I mean, it's a good, excellent point about Jesus' scars. We're going to know him by his scars, which tells us a little bit about getting to know one another. That we know one another by our scars. So there are questions here that, again, are overlapping and great questions. So let me quickly go through this, and I think this has to do with how to address a person. What does it look like to love a transgender person? How do I speak the truth to them without insulting them? How do we address the gender dysphoria with someone who doesn't share or believe our Christian perspective or is an atheist? Can you give practical advice for dealing with, for example, being expected to use someone's pronouns at work or in a school? How do we extend and nurture the need to be chosen, yet maintain and promote the virtue of humility? Actually, that may be something else. How do you respond when people say, well, you're a transphobe for thinking that or saying that? How do you address this issue with someone who's invested in it? Yeah. Where do you begin? Do you lead with the faith? Do you lead with questions? Do you avoid pronouns? So I'll start with you on this one too, Father.
Okay.
And we'll give everybody
Thank you
a chance.
very much.
But this could go on for the rest of the afternoon, but
Yeah.
let's try to keep it brief, but
Right.
please, let's do it.
So it could go on for the afternoon. In my own experience, I have just, like, avoided using pronouns entirely. Like, my experience as a priest is basically, like, somebody's either going to come to see me because they desire to, or somebody's making them. I don't have a lot of occasion to talk to people that are atheists because they just choose not to talk to a priest. Like I had a kid call me he was actually a second grader in my second parish, and he's transitioning now. And it was interesting because he also shared with me that he's autistic, which was one of those comorbidities, which is a specific difficulty in connecting with people, right? So there's a difficulty in feeling heard and understood by anybody. And he had also, like, studied his way into being an atheist, and so then there's no reference point for morality. And so if God doesn't exist, then we can self-determine who we are, right? So if somebody believes God doesn't exist, they can decide to do whatever they want to do. Like, morality is basically reduced to attunement and not hurting people. But we believe God exists. And so if I'm talking to an atheist, I would say, well, like, the first thing we could talk about is, like, what we believe about God. Like I believe God exists, you don't believe God exists. There's consequences to what I believe, there's consequences to what you believe. So we can't talk about this issue if we disagree about first principles. So we can talk about the first principles, right? And that's where we start our conversation. I would say, like, I'm not afraid of transgendered people. Like, I am perfectly fine talking to them. I'm not threatened by them. I have had the experience of talking to, like, LGBTQ plus therapists at trainings that I've gone to, which are really pretty interesting because they all expect, like, me to react to them in a certain way, and I don't. And then they don't really know what to do with it when I'm nice to them. And like, at the end of this training, this therapist who is now, he grew up Catholic, he's now in a partnership with another man. And he asked me if I could give a blessing through a picture, which I was like, that's interesting. Why? Well, I think it would be cool to get a blessing. I was like, I can just give you a blessing if you ask me. And then he was like, I said, you kind of want me to bless you, but you don't like that, do you? I'm just going to let you sit in that tension right now. Because there'll be consequences to the fact that I want to have a connection to a priest, and then there's consequences that are going to follow, right, which are going to involve changing life. So I'm going to pass to anybody else.
I think maybe Father mentioned this already, but number one is to ask a lot of questions before you make a lot of statements. Because people are coming from so many different places. If you're talking to someone and you don't know that they have a son or daughter that's transitioned with their parents' permission, you could really step in it, because you're now telling them that they allowed their child to be abused by going through a transition process. So that's not a good way to start any conversation. So whether it's a child or an adult or another professional, I think asking lots of questions and figuring out where they are first, and then exploring some of those things as you go. For the atheists, I've had plenty of those conversations. I'm not a priest, so I get approached by more atheists. And that's why it's so wonderful that we have the science that aligns with our faith. If I'm talking to a young person who's living with another person and they're not married, but they don't have any belief in God, I can explain to them the statistics about the divorce rates, and they skyrocket when you live with someone before marriage. Or if I'm talking to a young person about pornography, they may not have a moral view about pornography if they're an atheist, but we can talk about statistically all the damage that does to the human person and how that ruins relationships. And it's no different here. All the things that Dr. Roos talks about so beautifully about the science of gender ideology, those are all thoughts that we can communicate to someone even if they're an atheist. So we can have this conversation at a scientific impact level even if we can't have it at a moral level. But most of all, I think Father's right when he was talking about the importance of leaning in and living with someone in their suffering and how hard that is to do. And that doesn't just apply to gender dysphoria, that applies to anything. And the more that we can get to know someone, walk with them, let them know that we love them and we're not going anywhere no matter what choices they make, the more likely we're going to be able to have substantive conversations that bring them back to what God's plan is, and ultimately they're flourishing.
And I can add a little bit more. I agree. I mean, it's just, to round it out a little bit, we can talk at one level that I think is actually essential, and it's very important, but then we have to go beyond that and be more practical about it. We begin with love. And I often remind myself of that when I get asked that question, that I often have to take my own pulse. I have to, am I beginning in love, and am I remaining in love in my interaction with that individual? Because there is a danger, that we can get caught up into trying to defend what the church teaches, or, to talk about the science in a way that is the opposite of love. And what I mean by that, and it's been touched on many times this morning already, is that we will the good of another individual. And so for me to, in a practical way, address this question about how you speak to an individual that's affected by this, or that desires you, to acknowledge and accept their gender identity when it's discordant with their sex, that when I remind myself that I'm entering into this dialogue because of love, that is related to the question of truth. Now, in my world as a physician, I have an advantage in that when I first began caring for individuals with disorders of sexual development, we believed that we could mar somebody for life if we made the wrong assessment of what their sexual identity was. And so I learned very early on in training to be able to carry on extended conversations without using pronouns at all. It takes effort. But if you listen to people that are wanting to accept somebody's ideology, or they want to accept them, they will trip up all the time. And even when they're trying to use the pronouns because your mind, if there's a cognitive dissonance when you see a male and you're using the word she, or you're talking to an individual and they use a plural pronoun, they or something like that nature, there's a dissonance there that's very difficult, even if you want to accede to that. In the area of medicine, that for the good of the individual, as a doctor, differential diagnosis is very dependent upon what bonds one's sex. So when I'm on rounds, I need to maintain that objectivity so that I can be a good doctor. I'm going to fail in my role as a physician if I don't recognize the reality of what's there and how it influences them. And I think that those that are not in the medical profession, you can think of it in the same way. Okay, that if you desire the good of that individual, it doesn't mean that you enter into a battle or a dialogue or challenge their identity at all, but you need to be founded in truth if you truly love that person. So there are, I would say that in the area of preferred names and dress and things like that, that there is some room that you can accommodate somebody without accepting an untruth. The area of pronouns is very difficult because it's hard to speak in that way without conveying or actually engaging in something that is not inherently true. One way that I've seen it approached in the counseling setting is to say that this is my understanding of where things are. We're going to set that aside for right now to meet you where you're at right now, as long as there's a clear understanding. That's not going to work if you have somebody in the hallway that's screaming at you, that they hate you because you're not willing to use their pronouns. Again, you have to look at the situation. Your level of, is it a single one-time encounter? Is it with somebody that's pushing an agenda? Or is it a relationship that you have? And it's very different if it's a son or a daughter, if it's a cousin or a niece, or a friend of a friend, as far as what you're going to be able to do in that interaction. So again, it may not be as tight as far as how you can respond, but again, come back to that. Are you responding and interacting with love? And are you maintaining that love in that interaction? I think that's the truest test.
We're just about at the end here. So this is what I'd like to do. I'd like you each to take 60 seconds, 90 seconds, and just respond to what we've experienced here today and what you would like to leave everybody with, So, but it has to be short, okay? It has to be real short. Hot. Put your best editor in the executive function there. And these were really great questions. I wish we had more time. So let me start with you, Father.
Okay.
Leave us some closing words. 60 to 90 seconds.
Yeah, one of the gifts of talking about these things and giving presentations on these things is it's really helped me to learn to preach the gospel well. And the one thing that I think we all need to learn is that Jesus is enough for us. Right? Anytime we fall into sin, it's because I don't really believe Jesus is enough for me right now, or I don't believe that Jesus can satisfy my desires. And that's really, I think, what we all need to know. It's the goal of the spiritual life is for our hearts to learn to be satisfied by His love, and that's possible. And that's the most important thing that we can bring to somebody who's like in any form of human suffering.
Very good. John.
I would just say, don't be afraid to be educated and to engage on the issue of gender ideology. There are so many ways that humanity has fallen, and this really isn't different than any of the others, whether you're talking about abortion or divorce or pornography or same-sex marriage. I mean, you can go right down the list. And that all of these things are going to come up in our lives with family members or friends, and so we need to understand the church's teaching enough that when we have those dialogues that we want to show someone that we love them, that we can do it in truth and charity, and we always have to have both of those. One little helpful thing when you're talking to your kids or your grandkids, sometimes they think about all of the church's rules, especially on human sexuality, as being constraining, and that these are a bunch of no's and God's just trying to give us things, and if we don't satisfy them, then we're just going to get punished for that. And a better way to think about it is like a car manual, those things we used to have in the glove compartment and now we look on the computer. The manual for the car was made by the same person who created the car, the creator. And it's an instruction manual that we're free to follow or not, but it's designed so that the car can operate to its best possible capacity. So when we choose not to change the oil and the tires and the air filter and things like that, over time, the car will start to not work up to its capacity, and eventually it'll stop working altogether. And so all the church's beautiful teachings about the human body and about human sexuality work exactly the same way. The Creator gave us the guidebook so that we could live out our lives in a way that would be most conducive conducive to our own flourishing. And so we need to follow those, and we shouldn't be embarrassed at all to proclaim that news.
And to
Paul, I have to read this. Congratulations to Dr. Cruz on not yet losing his job.
Well, thank you. Really, I think this, I want to end my comments here. There's a lot that we address in this area that's very difficult, challenging, intimidating. What I hope that you will walk away from this morning is empowered in a way that you don't need to be on the defensive. That part of what we're talking about is something that's common to all of us in our interactions in relationships. And many people that I encounter that are struggling with this issue are hyper-focused on this one question, and they leave to the side all of the other dimensions of who they are as human persons, and to really, in the confusion, in the difficulty, in the challenges, recognizing that we're confronted with a very, very difficult situation, rather than one, to be defensive, or two, to want to run away from it, to be able to embrace the richness that's there in our human experience, that we all are drawn, to the epic, that battle, right, that of good and evil and self-fulfillment in all of its complexities, and so that we don't need to run away from it, we don't need to be defensive about it, yet, as has already been mentioned, that we need to focus on the good and the beautiful and the true, and that when we do that in a way in our sexual identity, that it can be not draining on us or lead us into fear or silence, but it will empower us to embrace the crazy world we live in, and we do live in a crazy world, in a way that really not only ourselves but those that we encounter to be able to have that human flourishing.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you.